Katie, and I'm back reading The Wild Edge of Sorrow by Frances Weller. We are on chapter 8, Entering the Healing Ground, the Sacred Work of Grief. The deeper the sorrow, the greater the joy. William Blake. I love trying new angles just because I think it's interesting and kind of boring to do the same thing every time. And I put my iPad on a chair and it kind of feels like we are having story time, which I love. So welcome to Storytime. I'm going to read you a story about grief. No big deal. It looks like we have chapter 8, chapter 9, and then I think that's it. So we're getting there. Okay, entering the healing ground, the sacred work of grief. In this meditation on grief, we have seen how sorrow works upon us, deepening and reshaping us through our many encounters with loss. Learning how to hold sorrow close to our hearts is a spiritual practice, a fierce and unflinching acknowledgement of the way of the world. As Irish poet John O'Donoghue wrote, life is a growth in the art of loss. Slowly, over many encounters with losses and departures, we become acquainted with the rites of grief. This art of loss is a tempering of soul, a gradual deepening that prepares us for our own inevitable leaving. This work thins us, making the inner aspects of our life more transparent to others. We become open and accessible. Whenever we touch the places of loss in our lives, at whatever gate they appear, we move closer to the earth. We become more intimate with our surroundings and lean into those we love. At least that is the invitation that true grieving offers us. In my own times of intense grief, I have been fortunate to find my way into the arms of my wife, my friends, and the greater community of woods and creeks and grosbeaks and ravens. There is a profound connection between the expression of grief and finding a genuine experience of belonging. Grief affirms the bond of affection, of affinity, and love. I was talking with a group of people about grief once when a man in his 70s asked me, "So, what is the 1, 2, 3 of grief? How do I get over this sadness?" I knew a little about him from what he had shared earlier in the evening. He had spent his life as a scientist, someone for whom there was always a solution, an equation, or a formula for the problem at hand. He had also said that he had recently lost his wife after a long and loving marriage. So when he asked the question, I paused and then said to him, "I can't accept the premise of your question. It implies an ending to your grief. I don't think it will end. It will soften over time and turn into a tender melancholy. In fact, your grief is your new relationship with your wife. It will be the ongoing reminder of your love and your life together. This sadness keeps her in your world." Later, after the evening concluded, he came to me and confided with tears in his eyes that what I had said to him had changed everything. He now was willing to welcome the ache that pervaded his whole being and see it as the new way of being in relationship with his wife. Night work. Grief takes us below the surface of our ordinary lives, dropping us into a world the color of a raven's wings. It is the night work, an encompassing surround of darkness and mystery. Our first associations with this landscape often involve fear and resistance. Yet every one of us alive today will face innumerable losses, both great and small, and we all take this journey downward into the belly of the earth. This is a sacred terrain filled with memories, the artifacts of a lifetime, ancestors, and spirits. Grief pulls us into the underworld, where we are invited to discover a new mode of seeing, one that reveals the holiness of all things. This journey to the underworld may last months or years. In the midst of this darkness, we come to realize that everything has to do with loving and not loving, as the poet Rumi reminds us. This teaching is fierce. It asks us to step fully into a conversation with things that happen in the night, in the dark hours of our lives. Some maturation occurs here, some cooking of the soul that requires these precise conditions. We pick up the orphaned and abandoned pieces of soul life and realize that they too are worthy of love. What is the work we are asked to do in the night world? Whether we are facing the loss of someone we love, wounds suffered in our childhood, the rips and tears experienced by the earth and her creatures, or our own eventual death, we are required to work with several essential things: to die before we die, to befriend the darkness, and to learn to let go. These practices ripen our grief into something that can, in turn, nourish our lives and the community. To die before we die. In his sonnets to Orpheus, Rilke wrote, Be ahead of all parting as if it has already happened. He encourages us to bring loss and death into the midst of our lives. By keeping our vulnerability and mortality close, we learn to meet each moment with presence, even as we know it is passing away. In the night world, we are invited into a conversation with death in which we are asked to look directly at the ways we are living. Are we fostering vitality, participation, intimacy, those qualities that matter to soul, or are we turning away and attempting to keep ourselves immune to the ways that life can touch and change us? We face many little deaths in our lifetime. A friendship ends, a business venture folds, or the inevitable changes we encounter in our aging body. What is key is how we choose to respond to them. Sometimes our choices reinforce a small life. At other times, by letting an old pattern die, we enter into a larger encounter with being alive. This ongoing ritual of shedding outworn skins, of being remade time and again, is an ancient understanding most notably witnessed in the work of initiation. Every initiation brings one to the precipice of death. In fact, there is no genuine experience of initiation without an encounter with death. We are required to die to the old image of who we thought we were and step across the threshold into a radically altered sense of self. Loss and grief are an invitation into a changed landscape, reminding us that everything is passing. By dying before we die, we are able to accept this fact and embrace this amazing chance we have to be alive. There is a proverb from Africa that says, when death finds you, make sure it finds you alive. I love this adage, a wise reminder that death is always present and that when it comes, it is best to meet it fully alive. As I wrote earlier, too many of us suffer from premature death, never fully embracing our life and being open to the beauty and terror of existence. This is a result in great part of our refusal to accept life on life's terms. Instead, we try to avoid pain and suffering. We don't turn our face into the world, into the full experience of life, but instead we slowly back into the grave, stubbornly trying to avoid our losses, ignoring the truth that these sorrows can be our greatest teachers, our greatest gifts. This half-life is not what we came here to experience. To change this story, we must be able to bring death close to us. We must be willing to live with the ways that death keeps us, paradoxically, aware of whether or not we are fully embracing our lives. To die before we die means that we must become radically honest with ourselves. We must shed the skins that do not foster aliveness. One man, while participating in the first weekend of the Men of Spirit initiation, suddenly realized how conscripted and narrow his life was. At that moment, he jumped out of his chair and flung it across the room in disgust. He clearly saw that he had unwittingly made an agreement to live small and to consistently tell himself what a good life he was living. This realization broke him open to the great well of grief he was carrying in his heart from all the times he had abandoned himself for the sake of fitting in and getting approval. The process of looking at our life and pruning the dead wood is essential. Coming to our death surrounded by untouched dreams and unlived life is perhaps the deepest grief we can encounter. I have sat with many people in their later years who possessed a profound remorse for what they had neglected to do in their lifetime. We are here for such a short time, and the call to truly live is something to which we each must respond. My daily practice is to wake and immediately bring my attention to this thought. I am one day closer to my death, so how will I live this day? How will I greet those I meet? How will I bring soul to each moment? I do not want to waste this day. I find this practice an acute reminder to die before I die, to stay awake. My poem, A Dream of Burning, speaks to our longing to fully live. To lift this wanting up out of dead wood, someone reaches up to stop this rising, as though the movement up is treasonous. This wanting has been frozen, caught in the grain of the fallen log for 10,000 years, memories of ice ages and mastodons. But in the wood is the dream of burning, of flames, heat and tongues of orange-red, leaping up into the night, warming those who come close by. This wanting breaks open the wood, the sow bugs, spiders, beetles, and the inevitable captains of decay are relieved of duty. This wood is for fire, and it's time to burn. To befriend the darkness. Entering the night world brings us into the territory of darkness. Here we move among shadows and whispers. Sometimes we can barely see where we are. We reach out our hands, hoping to find something solid. When we find ourselves in the night world, the sensation can be unsettling and frightening. The certainty of daylight has vanished, and we are invited to step into the unknown and undefined dimensions of our life. Grief takes us into a terrain where we must develop other senses, other ways of knowing. We must learn to see in the dark. Within this darkness, we become porous to another world. A crack or fissure appears in these times of sorrow, allowing us to touch other worlds, if only for a moment. We are granted a glimpse of a larger reality, far beyond the scope of our daily lives. For some, this is an entry into the sacred world, one filled with awe and wonder. For others, it is the confirmation of an intuition that there exists another world behind this world. Whatever the experience, grief offers a revelation. In the midst of great loss, we find ourselves in the presence of the sacred. Our culturally ingrained associations with the sacred usually connect it with the heavens, with the sky and the light. We like this idea of ascension, of things rising and moving toward the light. We are uncomfortable when we slip and fall, when we find ourselves descending into the darkness. However, when we compress the sacred into the narrow band of the heavens, we deny the holiness that dwells in the dark, in the roots of the earth, in the shadows within our bodies, the womb of our beginnings. Over 700 years ago, the mystic Meister Eckhart wrote, "What is this darkness? What is its name? Call it an aptitude for sensitivity which will make you whole. Call it your potential for vulnerability." Rilke adds, "Yet no matter how deeply I go down into myself, my God is dark, and like a webbing made of 100 roots that drink in silence." The darkness we enter when we are overwhelmed by the swell of grief is a place of belonging. It is the fecund and gravid darkness of the womb, the dynamic vitality of duende that pulses through our bodies when we are singing from the dark earth. It is the quiet thrum of nature moving through our senses and the body of the earth. Learning to befriend the darkness offers us a holding space where we are able to do the necessary work of metabolizing sorrow. This underworld domain is the sanctuary of our initiatory ordeal in which we are reshaped and remade under the hands of grief. It is the place where our apprenticeship with sorrow and our ability to be truly alive is deepened. It is the dreamtime offering images that quicken our souls and cause us to catch our breath. Coming to trust the darkness takes time and often involves many visits to this land. Our arrival here is rarely a chosen thing. We are thrown into the darkness or are carried there on the back of a blue mood. What we make of this visit is up to us. Recalling that the darkness is also a dwelling place of the sacred allows us to find value in the descent. In this place of lightlessness, we develop a second sight. A friend of mine once shared how one of his encounters with the darkness began following the death of his father. His relationship with his father had been difficult, filled with conflict, but during his dad's dying process, something shifted and the space between them softened. He was able to hold his father as he died, marking a profound change in the way he carried this relationship in his heart. Following his dad's death, he entered into the night world, and there he met his father in a radically new way. I'm going to pause for a garbage truck. We'll see. Dreams came in which his father was blessing him. Dreams came in which his father was blessing him. Offering gifts and, in a real sense, atoning for their painful life together. As my friend shared his dreams, I could feel how his way of seeing had been changed. The question here isn't whether this was his actual father speaking to him from the land of the dead. These dreams allowed him to see through to the other world. When he became porous to the other world, healing could move in both directions, from him to his father and back again. All of this occurred in the darkness, in the dreaming, where some strange alchemy transmuted loss into gratitude. Rilke's poem speaks to the faith we need to recover in the dark, in the deep of the night. You, darkness that I come from, I love you more than all the fires that fence in the world. For the fire makes a circle of light for everyone, and then no one outside learns of you. But the darkness pulls in everything, shapes and fires, animals and myself. How easily it gathers them, powers and people, and it is possible a great energy is moving near me. I have faith in nights. May we find in the dark what matters most to our soul, to our community, to our times. May we bring forth what is held within that all-nourishing abyss of which modern physics speaks, and may we offer it to our beleaguered world. Letting go. Every loss we experience in our lifetime has the capacity to deepen us, to widen the channel of soul life flowing into us. As we become familiar with sorrow and ease our resistance to its bittersweet tincture, we simultaneously become more able to love this astonishing world. Even as we recognize our own inevitable ending, there arises a feeling of gratitude, of grace, that we have been gifted with this time, these particular people, and this astonishing planet. One woman who attended a grief ritual we offered had been dealing with cancer on and off for over 2 decades. Recently, the cancer had returned in an aggressive fashion. When she heard about the ritual, she called me and asked how the experience would benefit her. We talked for 20 minutes or more about what might happen for her at the ritual. She decided to attend. On Friday night, we invited people to name the grief that was walking in the door with them. It was an intense circle of loss. Mothers whose children had committed suicide, people who had experienced foreclosure on their homes, individuals who had lost their jobs, and many other types of grief. When it was this woman's turn, she shared that she was possibly facing the last few months of her life. As she said this, I was reminded of how, in the Dagara culture of West Africa, when someone is seriously ill, straddling the threshold between this world and the next, she is considered a living shrine. Her proximity to the other world makes her a dwelling place for the sacred. This woman carried the energy of the living shrine with beauty and dignity. Her words were precise and honest. Her writings were filled with eloquence and fierceness. When it came time for the ritual, she shrieked and howled and wept, holding nothing back. She spent all of her coins at the shrine. Several weeks later, she sent me an email. She wrote, "These past few days have been filled with grief and glory, yet because of our shared experience, I feel strengthened to be with others and myself in a deeper and fuller manner. Our grief ritual has rippled through my life. Being together with you in an embodied manner is a place that celebrates embodiment and is a true gift. I really am standing more strongly in the world. It's a great gift of inestimable value. Wow. Each of us will come to the threshold of our own disappearance from this life. Our familiarity with grief is a key element in our ability to step into this transition with grace and presence. Working with grief keeps us present, ensuring that the sorrows of our lifetime have been touched and acknowledged, and that they are no longer dragging us backward into our history. The stories of our life have a gravitational pull that will demand that we address the unfinished business that lingers here. It is essential that we keep these stories in front of us, becoming fully conscious of them and sharing them with others. Only in this way can their weight draw us into the world and farther into life. If we deny the presence of grief, it slips behind us, and the gravity it carries pulls us away from the vitality of living. When we extend our cupped hands and offer a bottom to our grief, we can hear the story that lies there, needing our touch and affection. In Mary Oliver's exquisite poem, When Death Comes, we are reminded of this unavoidable passage into the night world. Her words, however, are not tinted with anxiety, but remarkably with curiosity. When death comes like the hungry bear in autumn, when death comes and takes all the bright coins from his purse to buy me and snaps the purse shut, when death comes like the measles pox, when death comes like an iceberg between the shoulder blades, I want to step through the door full of curiosity, wondering, what is it going to be like, this cottage of darkness? And therefore, I look upon everything as a brotherhood and sisterhood, and I look upon time as no more than an idea, and I consider eternity as another possibility, and I think of each life as a flower, as common as a field daisy, and as singular, and each name a comfortable music in the mouth, tending to all music does toward silence, and each body a lion of courage and something precious to the earth. When it's over, I want to say all my life I was a bride married to amazement. I was the bridegroom taking the world into my arms. And when it's over, I don't want to wonder if I have made of my life something particular and real. I don't want to find myself sighing and frightened or full of argument. I don't want to end up simply having visited this world. Grief helps us stay closely related to the other face of this mystery, which is gratitude. The tension between these two sisters, grief and gratitude, is what helps us to avoid leaving this life sighing and frightened or full of argument. We are freed to love this life, and when we are asked finally to release it, we can let go. There is a grief that comes with saying our goodbyes. It's difficult to pick up this thread and hold it in our hand. Each of us is fated to leave this shining world, to slip off this elegant coat of skin, to release our stories to the world, and to return our bones to the earth. Saying goodbye, however, is not easy, and it's not something we give much thought to in our daily lives. How do we say goodbye? How do we acknowledge all that has held beauty and value in our lives? Those we love, those who touched our lives with kindness, those whose shelter allowed us to extend ourselves into this world. How do we let go of sunsets and making love, pomegranates and walks on the bluff? And yet we must. We must release the entire fantastic world with one last breath. I will miss this world. What seemed like an eternity to the child is quickly arcing its way toward the time to leave. It is a short ride, a wild journey filled with every imaginable joy and sorrow. There is a feeling of melancholy that settles over me as I write these words, an anticipatory grief for the time when I will not be greeting the dawn. I have no idea what happens after we die, but I am reasonably sure that this sensuous encounter with heat and cold, with brilliant sunlight and the silvery light of the moon, will be absent, and that brings me to grief. It is a sweet grief, bittersweet, as they say, and I am resolved to this circumstance. If it were not so, I doubt we would see this life for the wonder it is. There is another face to this grief of saying goodbye. We must acknowledge the sorrow that others will feel with our death. This is an especially tender sorrow, one we must bear in our soul, the consequence of having been privileged to enter another's heart. It is an exquisite honor to have been carried along by another as someone they loved. Approaching his own death, psychotherapist Albert Kreinheder wrote in his touching book, Body and Soul, The Other Side of Illness. If parting is such sweet sorrow, death is the most sorrowful of all, but possibly also the sweetest of all. It is not just the goodbyes to spouse and lover and friends, but going away from everything, all the things we love to do but can do no more, all the things we wanted to do but never got around to. It would be false bravado to deny the great sorrow of death. Kreinheder goes on to the most intimate confession of all. Yet even if I can be truly composed and fully ready for this great transition, there is a sadness for those who love me, and I grieve for their grieving. I am deeply pained by the pain they shall feel. The broken bonds, what once was no longer is, the touch, the looks, the growings in and out together. Meaningful things done habitually without a thought of their doing are now gone forever and deeply missed. There is something so vulnerable about this sorrow. In part, this sorrow is connected to a realization that we mattered to others, that our presence in their lives affected them, and that they are going to grieve our absence. One man who joined one of our rituals shared his budding grief as he imagined his daughter's pain if he were to die suddenly. It is important to recognize that the love that has been offered to us, to take it close to our hearts, and then to realize that these bonds will be altered by our death. With this awareness, we are invited to embrace these connections more fully while we are alive, to love without limits, to give ourselves freely to those whose hearts have welcomed us. One woman in the Cancer Help Program shared how she and her husband had slowly realized that they were rarely sharing any intimate time together, physically or emotionally. When they spoke about it, they were both stunned to recognize that on some subconscious level, they were both avoiding one another in order to keep the presence of death from coming into their awareness. She cried the tears that come with loving another. She went home determined to open herself up to the bittersweet truth that is always present between them. Several years ago, I was working with a group of men who were in training to lead the men's initiation process. The teaching for that weekend was focused on grief, and as we approached the evening, I said that either we could do a grief ritual or we could try another ritual that had come to me. I called it a death ritual. They were intrigued and asked me to tell them about it. I shared what I had been shown in my imagination. For this ritual, we would dig 2 shallow graves about 6 inches deep and then gather some distance from the graves and begin singing a chant. Then someone would fall to the ground and we would gather him up and carry him to the grave, cover him with a cloth, and then return to our singing. The intent, I thought, was to give each of us a feeling of being carried by brothers to our grave, and then to have some time to lie there and feel into the temporary nature of life. What happened, however, was radically different. After the first man fell and the pallbearers carried him to the grave, a spontaneous eruption of grief arose at the thought of losing a brother. Suddenly the ritual was centered on saying goodbye to someone we loved, and the man in the grave was offered an amazing symphony of sorrow from his brothers. Hearing their cries of grief was stunning, and we all came away from the ritual wildly deranged, wondering what had just happened to us. We woke in the morning as if we had returned from some other world, feeling a deeper intimacy with one another. This ritual brought us face to face with the reality of losing those we love. Letting go is a difficult skill to acquire, and yet we are no different. We are offered no option but to practice. Every loss, personal or shared, prepares us for our own time of leaving. Letting go is not a passive state of acceptance, but a recognition of the brevity of all things. This realization invites us to love fully now, in this moment, when what we love is here. That was chapter 8. Okay, I will see you again for chapter 9. I hope you enjoyed that last chapter of the book.